216 plus. That's how many religions and Christian denominations exist within the United States today. Protestant, Evangelical Protestant, Catholic, and 20 identified others. And the fastest growing group, shown through a 2019 Gallup poll, is the group that includes 68.9 million atheists, agnostics, and humanists. The separation of church and state was meant to safeguard religious pluralism, but over time has warped into a means of creating a religious hierarchy. To restore this vital separation, let's first add up the problems of preferential religions as expressed by the founders. Then subtract the detrimental effects of the erosion of the separation over time. And finally, balance the problem with the demand that our elected officials take action on a return to a representative government that does not engage in religious discrimination, nor work to garner religious favor. From the beginning, people immigrated to the colonies seeking freedom from religious persecution. According to the Legal Information Institute in September of 2020, the framers of the U.S. Constitution and the members of the Constitutional Convention agreed that government should have no power to influence its citizens toward or away from religion. The Constitution disallows any religious test as requisite for public service, and the first clause of the First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. So Congress is prohibited from adopting any particular religion or interfering with an individual's exercise of religion. The Establishment Clause didn't make its way to the top by accident. The founders were well aware of the problems posed by a religious hierarchy. The essay, Thomas Jefferson and Religious Freedom, courtesy of the Thomas Jefferson Encyclopedia, says Jefferson explained to Benjamin Rush that he saw a strict separation of church and state to be the only thing to defend against the dangerous aristocracy of kings and priests. Furthermore, he voiced pragmatic concerns for minority religious groups that did not want to be under the power or influence of a national religion. And James Madison wrote that religion is essentially distinct from civil government. A connection between them is injurious to both. Now that we've examined the founders' intention to preserve the liberty of religious expression, we must examine the evolution of the separation into something else entirely. It started slowly, at least as far as those sitting in the Oval Office were concerned, and was publicly supported through spoken and written arguments from Andrew Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant, to Teddy Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and Jimmy Carter. But to analyze the beginning of the erosion of this founding principle, let's look to Social Science's Inquiry Magazine, Volume 2, 2010. Bridget Volochinsky writes that the presidency of George W. Bush seriously undermined the separation of church and state. Just 9 days after his inauguration, she writes, President Bush introduced a major public policy called the Faith-Based Initiatives. Through executive orders, he essentially helped religious organizations overcome government's bureaucratic obstacles to funding, produced a guidebook explaining how faith-based organizations could apply for federal grants, signed voucher legislation that took money from public education to fund, in part, religious education. And the list goes on. President Bush's evangelical leanings also increased the rigidity of policies regarding abstinence teaching, access to abortion, stem cell research, and same-sex marriage. Volochinsky writes, the U.S. Constitution mandates a degree of separation between church and state in order to prevent an alliance between religious interests and government, in order to prevent harm to this great nation. Instead, President Bush strengthened this alliance, and that was a dangerous step. Under Donald Trump, the separation of church and state eroded to a tipping point. According to Harvard law professor Lawrence H. Tribe in The Atlantic on June 29, 2020, the past few months have seen a near complete collapse of this principle with respect to the government funding of religion. Under the Paycheck Protection Program, which had at that point allocated $699 billion in subsidies to support small businesses during the pandemic, the government extended funding to churches in unprecedented amounts. The PPP rules were specific to protecting small businesses and nonprofits, but that rule was waived by the Small Business Administration under Donald Trump, and many large corporations and religious organizations received hundreds of millions in PPP loans. Worse yet, we learned as detailed reports finally emerged in November that Joel Osteen's megachurch received $4.4 million according to federal data, while the nonprofit Boys and Girls Clubs were turned away. And this is the same church that has received a great deal of public scrutiny for their refusal to open their church doors to help those displaced during natural disasters, such as Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Meanwhile, hate crimes against religious minorities have gone up by 37% since 2017, particularly among Jewish and Islamic American citizens. And although Donald Trump is not an overtly moral or pious figure, he embraced the vision of American culture that privileges Christian heritage and identity, further disregarding the beliefs of minority religions and the incredibly fast-growing non-religious demographic. Now, let's regain our balance and steady the perilous ground on which we find ourselves today to solve this tricky equation. Rachel Laser, CEO and president of Americans United, said, "The Trump administration's misuse of religious freedom to harm others has been unprecedented and corrupted the concept of religious freedom, using it to sanction discrimination, deny access to health care, and require taxpayers to fund religion." In an article in Global Baptist News on November 11, 2020, AU called on the incoming Biden-Harris administration to right the wrongs of the Trump administration and build a better future. That future is one that values religious freedom and equality for all, and one that each of us can commit to by contacting our congressmen and senators and demanding that action be taken to reverse the damage done by years of chipping away at the separation of church and state. And telling them to start by repealing the Muslim ban, because no one should be denied entry to our country based on their religion. By signing an executive order to restore and protect religious freedom for all Americans. By overturning President Trump's denial of care rule, which protects the religious beliefs of care providers over access to care for everyone equally. By supporting the Do No Harm Act, that would protect the constitutional right of minority religions to freely exercise their beliefs. By funding only public schools with public school funds, and by enforcing the Johnson Amendment tax code, which prohibits religious entities from endorsing or opposing political candidates. And we must demand that the government reflect the nation's religious diversity and the nomination of federal judges who respect the separation of church and state. We cannot allow this important principle of the American foundation to continue to erode. There is more clarity to the founders' intent than 2 of the last 3 administrations would have had us believe. And hopefully, some of the damage done to religious freedom can be corrected before it is too late. As the First Amendment tells us, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. Let us demand that Congress shall make no law that uses taxpayer dollars to cover the churches in their tax-exempt status. And for the 216 recognized religions and denominations in the U.S., it shall guarantee each and every one of us the right to believe and worship as we choose. Or, like me, and 68.9 million other Americans, not to.